Или даже, может быть, с 8. С 8 вот это. Мы кончили разбор этой потрясающей истории с называющейся именами краденым осленком. Вот. И начинаем, собственно, чтение. Давайте с 8 по 10. С 8 по 10, да.
Хорошо. Kai polloi ta himatia auton estrosan eisten hodon, aloit de stibadas copsantes ecton agron, kai ho proagontes, kai hoi acolutontes ecradzon, osanna eulogimenos erhomenos en onomati Kyriou, eulogimene erhomene Vasileia tu patros Simon David, osanna en tois ipsistuis.
Да. Многие устилали дорогу перед ним своими плащами, кто-то с резными в поле ветками, люди, шедшие перед ним и за ним, кричали: «Осанна, благословен грядущий во имя Господа, благословенно грядущее царство отца нашего Давида, осанна вышних». Отдельные слова здесь мы разбирали. Вот мы останавливались на грядущее, идущее. Вот, что здесь у нас в греческом тексте намного меньше, по-видимому, у Герхомена Беселея коннотаций с будущим временем и больше коннотаций с физическим хождением, чем в русском слове «грядущее». Кажется, у нас была некая дискуссия, по крайней мере, началась насколько вот это слово «грядущее» не является немножко over-translation. То есть в большей степени, чем еврейский текст, чем греческий текст, сам по себе привносит сюда, в наш перевод, вместо физических коннотаций, такие эсхатологические коннотации. As far as I remember, we stopped last time at discussing the connotations of the Greek erchomenos and erchomene in this context. Because on the one hand, this is a reference to Jesus who comes to Jerusalem. On the other hand, this verb may have connotations with something which is in future. In Russian language, these connotations seem to be much stronger than in Russian. And I've even discussed whether Russian грядущий in the meaning of future was in fact a later development in the history of Russian language. I do not know if anyone consulted the corpus русского языка since our last meeting. Probably no one.
Я немножко посмотрел, Михаил Георгиевич. Ну,
Да-да.
во-первых, в синодальном переводе там повторяется во имя Господа и в 10 стихе. И поэтому никто и не обращает на это внимания, вот на эту проблему. Потому что грядущее во имя Господа царство, тут уже, конечно, только о физическом движении можно понять. Вот, поэтому вот именно при переходе к критическому тексту и вот возникает вот эта двусмысленность, грядущее или будущее царство. Вот, но, как показывают примеры, уже в древности грядущее по-славянски используется в значении еще и будущее. Там как бы не всегда можно различить грядущее прямо сейчас, вот будущее, ну, в том смысле, что вот-вот наступит. Вот, но есть примеры, которые просто свидетельствуют о том, что это тождественно будущему. Причем самый ранний пример, который я где-то нашел, это списки с рукописи, наверное, всем любимого Упыря Лихого. То есть это один из...
Простите, с рукописи какой?
Упырь Лихой, первый
Упырь
русский,
лихой.
да, новгородский книжник, это 1047 год. Ну, правда, это списки, но будем считать, что они более-менее соответствуют. В общем, он пишет о том, что настоящее время яко грядущее глаголы. Там, я могу целиком эту фразу скинуть, если интересно. Ну, в общем, там как грамматический термин используется грядущий. Ну и в синодальном переводе, в славянском, там часто глагол «мелло» тоже передается тем же самым «грясти» в инфинитиве. Так что это не особенность последнего десятилетия. Вот,
Вот я как так
старый
и подозревал.
славянизм.
Вот я как так и подозревал. Вот. Спасибо, Антон Дмитрий. Я сейчас бегло переведу для Джоэля. Joel, did you grasp our discussion?
Well, so you're talking about erchomenoi, and your translation is gradushtia, and you're saying that gradushtia loses some of the futuristic sense?
On the contrary, in Russian, грядущий is, on the one hand, a literal correspondence to the Greek archomenos, грядущий, one who goes, but on the other hand, it's a peculiarity of Russian language and Old Church Slavonic language that the same verb or the same participle is also used with the reference to the future. For example, often, as Father Dmitry noted, in Russian church texts, грести, грядущий, corresponds to Greek melon.
Yeah.
And this makes one problem, which is not specifically related to Russian language, Russian text, but this problem seems to be more interesting and important for Russian readers. How much eschatological connotations does this archomene have in the Greek text? And of course, behind this is not just a lexical problem, but the whole bunch of problems related to eschatology in Mark's Gospel. And if here we have really a pun on Jesus coming to Jerusalem, and at the same time, Erchomene Basileia as a reference to the eschaton. Can we treat this as an example of realized eschatology in Mark?
Well, yeah, I'm not. I mean, it points towards an eschatology in process of being realized, I would think, right? That I mean, you know, I guess you could take the erchomenos in both ways, you know, that it's a sign that God's coming kingdom is about to come and maybe already is starting to come. So, what's most interesting to me in verse 9 is there's a parallelism between blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord and blessed is the coming king. So, and he is coming at this moment into Jerusalem. So he is arriving in some sense. But does that mean that this arrival is the full arrival? And the other thing I'd like to throw in here is, so this is using a psalm, right? Psalm 118. And in that psalm, it's a pilgrimage psalm, right? And I think what's going on in the original psalm is, the people who are already there on the Temple Mount are welcoming the pilgrims who are coming up to the Temple Mount, and they are saying, "Blessed in the name of the Lord is the one who comes." Like the original is something like Baruch haba b'shem Adonai, and like even in modern Israel, when you're welcoming somebody, you say Baruch haba, right? Blessed is the one who comes, literally, but it just means I welcome you. So I think, there's an eschatological and messianic transposition of what's going on in the original psalm in its use here. Because again, in the original psalm, it's just welcoming any pilgrim who comes up. You're welcoming them in the name of the Lord. So in the name of the Lord modifies the welcome. But Mark understands the in the name of the Lord as a Christological reference to Jesus who comes in the name of the Lord. So I think that's...
Once again, Joel, which psalm do you refer to?
Psalm 118. Or in the Septuagint, it's 117.
Okay.
Near the end, verse 26. So it's sort of like what goes on in the first few verses, like the one who comes in the name of the Lord. There's a similar Christological transposition in the usage of the Isaiah text there, as there is here in the usage of the Psalm text.
Okay. That's...
So you notice that it's parallel to we bless you. Blessed is the one in the next verse. We bless you. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord.
Yes, but
and you also have Hoshiana, right? So that's...
this psalm is about coming of the righteous one, probably to the temple, yes? In Greek text.
Of any righteous person, right? It's, I mean, you have to be righteous, you have to be morally clean to come up to the temple, right?
Yes, exactly. Anno exate moi piulas decaiusiones. Esetol autais exomologesamai to Kyrio. This is probably indeed a reference to coming of the righteous one towards the temple of the Lord. Yes. Autahe pure to Kyrio, dikaioi, esolosante, and aute.
Right,
Yes.
but not necessarily the righteous one, like a messianic figure. It's just any pilgrim. This is the
Yes.
qualifications for, coming up to the temple.
Yes. Then we have the praise that the righteous one gives to the Lord. The next verse, Liton hon Padokimasen, Roy Ecodomundas, Otus Ageneta, Eiskephales, Gunias, will later be mentioned in Jesus' controversies with his opponents. So at least this verse already in the gospel is interpreted as a reference to Jesus. Whether this goes back to historical Jews or not, we cannot know for sure. But in the Psalms, both in Hebrew and Greek, this is not yet connected with any messianic idea. Probably.
Yeah.
Probably this reference to what in the Psalter?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think most literally it's probably about some stone, that was built into the temple that was originally considered not suitable. But it's interesting here when we get to it. So, this passage is used at the end of the parable of the tenants in chapter 12. Uh, and in Hebrew, you have Eben Ma'asu Habonim.
Yes, that's what we have on the screen, yeah.
And, people have speculated that in this controversy story, in the parable, there was originally a pun, Bonim versus Ben, right? The builders versus the son. Like a Hebrew or Aramaic, or I guess it would be a Hebrew pun.
Yes, but this pun definitely doesn't go back to the time of the Hebrew songs. There's no
There's no Ben in. Yeah.
Yes, there's no Ben here. So at what time, at what stage of the development of the religious ideas?
So I guess the idea is that it would be at a, before the parable was translated into Greek, right? Maybe I think maybe it's used as an argument sometimes that it goes back to the historical Jesus, though I'm skeptical about that.
That's Mark chapter 12.
Well, yeah, at the end, like 12, 11 or 12, or 12, 10 maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
12, 10, yes.
But you notice that, in the parable itself, there's a reference to a huios. So this pun doesn't work in Greek, but people speculated that, there may have originally been a pun in Hebrew. Though I speak I think Jesus spoke Aramaic though, so I don't think it works in Aramaic.
Yes, this doesn't, at least to me, this doesn't look very persuasive.
Oh, well, we can talk about it when we get to chapter 12, but
Yes. Okay. Let's look towards chapter 12 and towards the discussion. But I think it's probably more important, and probably even more important for the logic behind this reference to our psalm in Mark 12, that this psalm is being quoted and referred to in our text. Probably.
So somebody in the tradition knows this psalm, right? I mean, the psalm is used both in chapter 11 and in chapter 12. Different parts of it are used.
Yes, and in the reinterpretation of this verse, of this psalm, whatever was its meaning in its original Hebrew setting, but in Mark, both times the psalm is being interpreted as messianic. Yes?
Yeah.
Can we say this? Because it seems that here in Mark, differently from the Hebrew Psalter, Eulogomenos Hoerchomenos Enonomoti Kyriou is not just everyone who being righteous and morally fit enters the temple, but rather this seems to be the background for that acceptance that Jesus had during his entrance to Jerusalem.
Yeah, and it's like so much of the Old Testament usage in Mark and in the Gospels in general. It's all, or so much of it is Christologically refocused.
Yes.
And in this case, I think it's eschatologized. I don't think the original psalm is eschatological, but the usage, to back to the original subject, the usage that Mark makes of it is, I think, eschatological. Whether that's, for the service of realized eschatology or futuristic eschatology or both.
Okay. Regard to verse 10, we have probably to ask ourselves whether Basileia here is a reference to Jesus. Yes. The parallelism between 9 and 10 points to understanding of Jesus as Basileia to Patros Hamon David. He's.
Can you put your text, your dialogue
Yes.
back
Okay.
on the screen?
Let's put the dialogue. Our dialogue to the screen. Yes.
So there's no reference to it. Yeah, there's no reference to a basileus, right? It's a basileia.
Yes. Can this be a kind of metonymy? Basileia instead of Basileus, or this is not reference to Jesus himself, but rather to the whole situation. It's not just the king, but the kingdom about which Jesus preached, which is coming.
Yeah, I mean, well, so, I mean, there is a parallel, I'd say a synonymous parallelism between the ho erchomenos and he erchomene basileia. So there's a relationship there between the basileia and the one who comes. But I guess I'd say they're probably not identical, right? But related.
Yes. Earlier in the gospel, we have Jesus and John preaching about Basileia tuteu. But here we have a different expression, having more political overtones.
Yeah,
Is
could be. Yeah. I mean,
this Basileia different?
Well, so I guess this raises the question, how do these characters who are saying it, how do they understand what they're saying? And is that identical with what Mark thinks the reader should understand? So maybe you could say that the characters think that they're looking for, a coming more political, earthly kingdom, but the readers understand it in connection with the whole proclamation of the Basileia to Theou from the beginning of the gospel, and with the way they think, that's fulfilled by Jesus' death and resurrection. What did Larissa say? David's kingdom is ruled by, David's dynasty, David's descendant, the Messiah. Yeah, I'm sure that's how Mark understands it, or I think it is how Mark understands it. Though you do have the passage, I mean, the one thing that, so, you have had Jesus hailed as Son of David at the end of chapter 10 by Bartimaeus. Now, he comes into Jerusalem and he's connected with the coming kingdom of David. So that all seems to set up a positive Davidic image. But then later on in 12:35 to 37, you're going to have this strange discussion of whether or not the Messiah is David's son, which when we come to that, it's an interesting thing to talk about, because it seems to me that on the face of it, it is denying that the Messiah is the son of David, or that that's a full definition of who he is.
Sorry, Joel. May I ask you to repeat your last statement once again?
Okay, so you have had already at the end of chapter 10 a positive relationship. Jesus hailed as Son of David by Bartimaeus. Now you have that connection strengthened. Jesus comes into Jerusalem and people link him with the coming Basileia of our father David. So those two set up a positive typology, Davidic typology. But in chapter 12, verses 35 to 37, which we haven't gotten to yet, Jesus himself raises the question, how do the scribes say that the Messiah is the son of David? And I think the logic there suggests that the Messiah is not the son of David, is the answer. He's not the son of David, but maybe the son of God. So I think Mark is, working with probably a pre-existing connection between this messianic figure and the line of David that you get from the Old Testament and you get from Psalms of Solomon 17, but he is also qualifying it with the passage that we haven't gotten to yet in chapter 12.
Okay.
But it's all very complicated. It's too complicated.
Yes, that's complicated. One more question that I think we may discuss before moving forward is what is the Hosanna and tos hypsistois?
Yeah, and why does Mark give Hosanna in a transliteration of the Hebrew instead of translating it?
He does this from time to time
Yeah.
in the most important for him, in passages that he thinks are especially important, like Talita Kum or Lamash Baktan
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Abba.
and Abba.
And
Yes, but
yeah, and the cry of dereliction, which I guess you already said. Yeah.
yes,
And how
but
does he understand Hosanna? Because in the Hebrew, Hoshiana, it's like save us. But
yes,
does he understand that? Do he and his readers understand that? Or has it become just an acclamation, as it is like in my church, like at the beginning of Easter time, we all walk around outside and we say, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. But I don't think most people understand that it comes from this Hebrew that means save us. They just think it's an acclamation, like hooray.
yes, but if we take the original meaning, save us, then what is the meaning of Hosanna and tos hypsistois?
Yeah, good question, isn't it? Yeah.
Because even syntactically, what does this mean? Save us in the upper parts of the heavenly sphere.
Yeah. Yeah, nie znаю. I mean, because obviously this is taking place in the earthly sphere, the lower sphere. I mean, unless you want to say that it means something like, send your power from on high, send it down to us to save us in this lower sphere. But then the N is difficult, I think. I mean, if it was Hosanna ek
Yes,
ton subsistum.
it would have been more logical.
Yeah. And I don't think that's not part of the original psalm, is it?
No.
Yeah.
And we do not have in the original psalm anything that could have been paraphrased like this.
I mean, I just thought of this, but maybe I don't think this is true, but maybe you could say, so Jesus and the other pilgrims are coming up to Jerusalem. So come to this higher level and save us up here physically. But I don't think that works. But
I don't think either. We may look at the usage of hypsistos in the Greek text.
yeah, so where you get it in Mark is like in the Gadarene demoniac, the Gerasene demoniac in chapter 5, where it's a term for God, right?
Yes, it's
Son
term
of the
of
Sistu.
God. Yes, and we also have in Luke 1:32. I'll bring this passage to the screen. Ios hypsisto, dynamis hypsisto,
Mm-hmm.
prophetas hypsisto.
Yeah, Luke likes this one a lot. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 usages in Luke. 2 in Mark, 1 in Matthew.
Yes,
None in John.
exactly. But what we have in Luke is quite close, textually close to our doxa and hypsistois teo.
Yeah.
Epiges airene, canantropos eudokias.
Right, though it makes more sense in Luke 2:14 than it does in Mark 11, whatever that is.
Yes, unless we accept that already in the language of the Markan community, Hosanna already moved semantically from the original Hebrew meaning of Hoshiana towards the meaning that it has in your church, like acclamation, doxa, and so on.
Yeah.
But since we have the earlier meaning of Hoshana as an appeal to God, save us, not only in the Psalter but in rabbinic texts, then the Hebrew tradition, by the time of the rabbis, remembered well the original meaning and syntax of this, save us. So this meaning of Hosanna towards becoming just an acclamation, synonymous to doxa, exclamation mark, should have occurred somewhere already in the history of the tradition, after the tradition left its Semitic motherland.
Now, in my commentary, I say that in rabbinic texts, Hoshiana retains the sense of save us, but you're saying it becomes just an acclamation in some rabbinic texts?
No. As far as I remember, and you also mentioned it in your commentary, in the rabbinic literature, this has the same meaning as the Psalms, as in the Psalms.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Good. Yeah.
I mean,
okay.
We ask God to save us.
Right. Yeah.
And then if the syntax of this Hosanna in Mark is the same as the syntax of doxa in Luke, then probably this movement towards this syntax and the shift in meaning related to this syntax should have occurred outside the Semitic milieu.
Right. Yes. Yeah, that seems logical to me. Yeah.
Okay.
It-
But what can we?
the other
What
thing
can we?
that people, yeah, the other thing that people say about hoopsistos as a term for God, as it is in Mark 5:7, and in some of these other passages, is that I mean that's kind of an international term for God, the Most High. I mean it has Semitic roots like Shaddai, uh, but it would. I think there's probably parallels, or at least conceptual parallels, to Greek and Roman texts, so that people say that it's significant that in Mark 5, this is occurring in a Gentile area. And that's where Jesus is hailed by the demon as he's related to God the Most High. So I don't know if that would carry over into Mark 11:10 or not. Maybe, probably not, but it may have something to do with the prominence of the term in Luke.
Yes, and Dmitry correctly brings a parallel from Matthew 21:9. Before we move to Matthew 21:9.
Yeah. So Matthew is making it more explicitly Christological, right? Now it's no longer just the basileia, but it's also Jesus as the son of David.
Yes. Hosanna to your David. In the first part of the verse. And of course, in the Matthean context, this looks like much more like the acclamation in your church than like the original meaning of Hosanna.
Yeah.
Hosanna plus dative. Yes.
Yeah. No, that's good.
Hosanna to your David.
Yeah.
While in Luke, in parallel text, he simply he keeps the Markan construction, but changes Hosanna to doxa.
Yeah. No, that's
So
good.
both,
I like that.
so both Matthew and Luke probably confirm our idea that already for the Markan community and its background, Hosanna was something quite different from the meaning that Hosanna had in the Psalms. And though the Psalms are at the root of this, it becomes just the sign of acclamation, like in your church.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's probably significant that this foreign word is retained, because foreign words can have, a great power, and there's something special about them sometimes. And I think it probably means that in Mark's church they're saying Hosanna like they do in my church, and they're probably saying Abba too. And and even Paul, he says, he uses Abba also. So, the foreign language can be retained as a specially, almost magical language.
Yes. In Russian language, the Russian dictionary tells me, петь или восклицать «Осанну» кому-нибудь, значит крайне превозносить кого-нибудь. In fact, in Russian language, Osanna became just a normal substantive with the meaning glory or praise. One can sing this Osanna in accusative, or just say Osanna.
Yeah.
Probably.
I'm not sure. Yeah. I'm not sure I've ever seen anybody make the link with the Luke 19:38, and I mean, you should see if somebody has written that up, and you know, do a little. If not, somebody can do a little critical note and send it into SBL and get another little article published.
Okay. The problem is whether someone has written on this earlier, but
Yeah.
it's really very interesting thing, and probably the earlier passage in Luke where angels say doxa and hypsistois to is inspired by Luke 19, doxa and hypsistois, where doxa replaces Hosanna in Mark.
Yeah. No, I mean, so I guess, yeah, if one were going to write this up, the first thing to do would be to look at, you know, recent commentaries and, you know, extensive commentaries on Luke and look at Luke 19:38 and see if they comment on this. I think there's a term in linguistics, semantic bleaching. Maybe it's not exactly semantic bleaching, but well, it is in the sense that you're losing part of the sense of Hoshiana, right? It's becoming something else.
Yes. Becoming something else, and probably take into account Luke's interpretation more linked with the idea of messianism.
Mm.
This can explain the indignation that wait a second. Was it in Mark?
The indignation is in Matthew, I think, isn't it?
Indignation is in Matthew. Where
Probably in the next verse, yeah.
Next verse.
Yeah, well, yeah, so it says in verse somewhere, you had Esethe, right? The whole city was stirred.
Yes, yes. But where is it? I cannot find it. Since I just look at this. Oh no, probably it was in Luke. In Luke, immediately after this scene, Elogomenos Homenos Hobisileus and Onomati Quiriu and Orano Eirene Kaidoxe and Hypsistois. Once again, very close to the scene of nativity in Luke. Kaitines ton Pharisaion, apot ochlo eipan prosoton didaskale, epicemeson tois matetais so. So at least in Luke, this scene is understood as clearly having this acclamation where the Hosanna doxa is understood as having messianic overtones.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting in Matthew too, though. In Matthew 21, 14 and 15.
Do you see now Bible Works on the screen?
Yeah, Bible Works.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, and in the next verse, the chief priests and the scribes, they're upset by what, by all these people shouting. And they tell Jesus they say to Jesus, don't you hear what they're saying? And Jesus says the thing, out of the mouth of babies comes praise, in verse 16. So that's interesting. It's that's an agreement between Matthew and Luke over against Mark. In both cases, some of the people there take offense at what's going on, and that's not in Mark. And in Matthew, he used a little bit earlier the verb esathe. They were moved, and that's the same verb that he uses in chapter 2 for Herod and the whole city is also, they're disturbed by, the wise men who come from the east. So there may be an undertone in both cases to esathe of, they're upset about it.
Yes. Probably the last question that I have with regard to this paragraph, but probably we can turn to this question some other time, is how does all this fit into the Markan idea of messianic secret? Because before this scene and after this scene, Jesus and the narrator are very much preoccupied with keeping Jesus' messianic dignity in secret. But here, there's even no necessity to tell that Jesus is the Mashiach, because everyone, hoipaloi, crowds at the entrance of Jerusalem, they already know this.
Okay, well, yeah, I say something a little bit about this in my commentary. So, I mean, that's clear in Matthew, that it's just the crowds who are saying it. Is it totally clear in Mark? Because, are we sure that these aren't disciples? In verse 9, hoi preagontes kai hoi akaluthuntes, and akaluthuntes or akalutheo can be a term for discipleship. So, I think it probably is supposed to be the crowd, but that's a possible way out of that, to maintain the messianic secret.
Yes, but if, for example, you come to Moscow and 12 people around you tell and cry something that is a clear reference to messianic dignity, this is not a good keeping of messianic secrecy, messianic secret. even if this polloi here refer not to the crowds as usually, but to the 12 disciples, they obviously didn't keep the secret.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of inconsistencies about the secret, aren't there?
Yes.
And you can say this is one of them, but it's not as explicit as like Peter saying, "You are the Christ." It's, these people making some sort of connection between this one who comes and the coming kingdom of David, but it's not explicit. And it's not as explicit as like when the high priest asks him at his trial in chapter 14, "Are you the Messiah?" But I agree with you about the comparison to the next time I'm in Moscow, and if you are hailing me. So, but when that happens, let's talk about it.
Okay.
Yeah,
We're looking. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that in my view, it is not clear whether these people really imply that Erchomenos is a messianic title here. It's not obvious here. I mean, from the narrative, of course, it's obvious for Mark, for the author, but not for people who read just this line from the psalm, where it's not a messianic title.
Well, I do think that happens often in Mark, that people say things that mean more than they realize.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah.
Like when Pilate questions Jesus, he says, "You are the King of the Jews," and Jesus says, "You have said." So that's Markan irony. He's posing a question, but Jesus takes it as a statement.
Yes, but this contradicts what I have learned about the meaning of Hosanna in Mark, because if this Hosanna in Mark had the same meaning as in the Psalter, then just someone comes to Jerusalem and people just meet him with exclamations which are normal for greeting someone who comes to Jerusalem, no problem. But if, and we have seen this from the syntax of Hosanna and hypsistois, if this is already not just something, not just our prayer to God, but a kind of acclamation, quite close to what we have in Matthew, Hosanna, and in Luke, Doxa, then it's already in the realm of messianic.
But why?
Idea. Why?
I don't think that it's necessary.
I mean, I agree that it's implied, and that the reader sees that this is, whether these people know it or not, they're claiming Jesus' messiahship. But I still think that it's still a step to being so explicit about it as Peter is in chapter 8. And so I think back about this couple of articles I wrote about the Lubavitcher Rebbe and the historical Jesus. You know, the Lubavitcher Rebbe was also believed to be the Messiah, you know, by some of his followers already in his lifetime. But he never said, I am the Messiah, you know, but it was all implicit for those who were in the know, for the insiders. They could recognize that it was a messianic claim. And, you know, but that's still, you preserve a bit of deniability, you know, by not making it explicit. And I think you could say this, that, you know, the same is going on here, though I agree that it points in the direction of messiahship.
Okay. Do you have any more comments on these verses which deal with Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem?
Well, just
I
maybe. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention it, but I don't remember whether it's it is something what I read somewhere, or it's just my idea, which I wanted to discuss, is whether this Erchomenos as a messianic title is somehow connected with Daniel 7:13, where Son of Man, again Erchomenos, it's actually the only two places where Erchomenos appears in Gospels, and in that case it is messianic. It is connected with the Messiah, with the Son of Man, for sure. And I remember that I had an idea that probably this usage from Daniel could somehow influence this reinterpretation of Erchomenos in other places.
Yeah, it also occurs in John the Baptist, right? Or in John the Baptist preaching, not in Mark, but I think in Matthew and or Luke, maybe in Q, or Homenos.
Maybe.
I think it occurs there. Yeah.
There are several cases of Erchomenos both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament.
But the one that Maria is talking about, it is cited again at the trial scene, right?
In Mark, it's not Erchomenos, it's Erchomenon, I think, accusative, but in Mark it appears only twice, only here and in chapter 13 about son of the man.
In 1460. Yeah.
With
in chapter 14.
With the clouds.
Yes, and I think I have put on the screen Matthew 11:3 speaks quite clearly in favor of Erchomenos being already a kind of messianic title.
Right, and this is in the mouth of John the Baptist, right?
Επιναωτό σιου ο ερχόμενος heteron προς το κόμεν.
Yeah, so at least it's being attributed to a pre-Christian figure, John the Baptist. Yeah, I would think that, again, biblically literate readers would probably make a connection with Daniel 7, especially since Daniel 7 is so critical for the Son of Man title, which is ubiquitous in the Gospels.
Yes.
The other thing I wanted to say was it's interesting in Matthew and maybe also in Luke, but Jesus immediately after this, after saying this, goes into the temple and cleanses the temple. In Mark, it doesn't happen that way because you have verses 12 to 14, the beginning of the fig tree parable.
Мгм.
Then he goes in and cleanses the temple. Then he comes out of the temple and interprets the fig tree. You see that the fig tree is withered, right? But in the story as we have it in Matthew, Jesus is hailed as homenos, and then he immediately goes into the temple and does what you could interpret as a messianic action of cleansing. But Mark, and I think maybe that's the story as it came down to Mark, is more like Matthew, but Mark wants to use his technique of sandwiching, intercalation, so he wants to interpret the cleansing of the temple by means of the fig tree action. So he surrounds the cleansing of the temple with the fig tree, which is something that he typically does, to interpret two stories in terms of each other.
Okay. Any more comments on this pericope? Если нет, то давайте. У нас еще есть немного времени. Мы можем начать следующие.
Just to follow up on what I just said, in Mark, the story ends somewhat anticlimactically, right? In verse 11, he just, so you've had all these crowds yelling, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes, strewing their garments. And then in verse 11, he goes into Jerusalem, and what does he do? He just looks at the temple, and then he goes back to Bethany. I mean, the story in Matthew, it's a better story. Everybody's, there's all this messianic excitement, and then he goes into the temple and wham.
Yes, but on the other hand, this Matthean composition makes the parable of the fig tree less prominent.
Yeah, it makes, I mean, in Mark, it's a hermeneutical action, his cursing of the fig tree and it withering. But in Matthew, again, it's a better story because he curses the fig tree and it immediately withers up. So, just on the level of kind of oral narrative, I think Matthew's story is better, but Mark's is maybe more profound.
Yes. Okay. Let's read next paragraph, that is next verse 11. Отец Дмитрий, вы с нами?
Да-да. Только 11.
Это пока один, да.
Да. Кай сельтен эйс Иерусалима эйсто игерон, кай переблепсаменус панта, упсиос эде усис тес орас, exulten es Betanian metaton dodeka.
Он вошел в Иерусалим в храм и все осмотрел. Час был уже поздний, и он вместе с 12 вернулся из города в Вифанию. Ну, давайте, может, прочтем еще следующие 3 стиха.
Кайте эпаurion exultunton auton apobetanias epeinasen, kai idon syken apomakroten echuson fulla elten, ei arati evrise enaute, kai elton epauten uden evren ei me fulla, ogar kairos uken sykon, kai apokriteis eipenaute, meketi eistona iona exu medeis karpon fagui, kai ekuon oimatetai autu.
На следующий день, когда они выходили из Вифании, Иисус почувствовал голод. Он издали увидел покрытую листьями смоковницу и пошел посмотреть, нет ли на ней плодов. Подошел, но плодов не увидел, одни листья. Еще не пришла пора смоков. Он сказал ей: так пусть никто вовек не вкусит твоих плодов. Ученики слышали это. Okay. Joel has already mentioned the sandwiching device characteristic of Mark, so that the fig tree here becomes a symbol of Jerusalem or Jerusalem hierarchy. As far as I remember, the miracle of the fig tree is the only one miracle that Jesus did in Jerusalem, according to Mark. Am I mistaken?
I think that's right. Yeah. And it's a destructive miracle.
Yes. And it's there's an important contrast with what he does in Galilee, where there are a lot of miracles, and all of them are constructive.
Yeah.
What would be the right term here? Constructive, beneficial?
Yeah. Both of those terms would be fine.
Yes.
It's interesting. I think you could make a good case that this miracle story has grown out of a parable, because in Luke, I think only in Luke, you also have a parable. Well, you have a parable about a fig tree at the end of Mark 13, but in Luke you also have a parable of a fig tree in which, it's just a parable that there was this fig tree and it didn't produce fruit, and somebody wanted to just uproot it, and somebody else says, no, give it another, let's put some fertilizer on it, and let's see if it produces fruit. So you have, and I think probably already C.H. Dodd, and probably somebody before him, argued that, this kind of strange miracle story in Mark 11 and parallels comes out of the parable about the fig tree in Luke.
Yes, it's quite probable, as when we speak about the historical Jesus or the early tradition. But in Mark, I think it's very relevant for our understanding of the logic and sacral geography of Mark's Gospel. Remember, I asked you last week in a letter about sacral geography and the opposition between Galilee and Judea.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah,
probably nowhere does this opposition in Mark becomes so clear. Galilee is the land of miracles, except one city, Jesus' native city, where he was unable to produce any miracle. Galilee is also, Jerusalem is also an exception, like his native city, in that he does not produce any positive, any constructive miracle, but contrary to both Galilee as such and his native city, he produces a negative, destructive sign here.
Well, yeah, and his, of course, his destructive sign corresponds to the destruction that is going to happen to him in that city. So
Yes.
I think it's right that Jerusalem is basically a locus of opposition, and Galilee is more of a locus of salvation, though there are some negative things that happen in Galilee also.
Yes, and obviously this has something to do with the very last verses of the Gospel, where they, contrary to Luke acts and probably to historical reality, the Jesus disciples are summoned to go to Galilee.
Yeah, well, and also in John, there are appearances in Jerusalem and then appearances in Galilee. But yeah, I think it's more likely that the first appearances to male disciples happened in Galilee.
You mean in John, in Mark, or in history?
I was talking about in history that, the first traditions are about appearances to male disciples in Galilee, and that then as the tradition develops, the tradition of Jerusalem appearances also appears. Because, so the earliest gospel is Mark, and it refers to Galilee appearances. And that also seems to be the assumption in Matthew. And Luke has an interest in Jerusalem, so it would make sense that he would want there to be Jerusalem appearances as well.
But there's no Galilee appearances in Luke at all.
Yeah, that's
Because
true. He's Jerusalem-centric.
Yes. So according to Luke, the disciples were in Jerusalem, where they saw the resurrected Lord. According to Mark, they are told to go to Galilee, but we do not have the ending of the story. Matthew, in fact, just supplements the Markan story with the necessary, and if they were told to go to Galilee, then obviously, according to the logic of Matthew, they did so, but did not hear it in Mark. I always ask myself whether, in the overall context of Markan polemics against the disciples who are known from the tradition of Acts to be in Jerusalem and to live in Jerusalem, to continue the preaching in Jerusalem, whether this summon to the disciples to go to Galilee and the abrupt end just mean Markan rejection of the disciples. Jesus told them to go to the good land, but they remained here in the center of hierarchy, power, and violence, and
Mhm. Yeah.
probably became themselves infected with this. Or
Well,
maybe I'm reading too much into Mark.
Well, again, you know, this is what there were, you know, Norman Perrin and his students, that's what they believed,
Yes, yes.
60s and 70s. I don't agree with it, but, you know, it's probably too long a discussion. I mean, the only thing I would say is, look, Jesus prophesies that he's going to see them in Galilee, right? So all of Jesus' other prophecies have come true. So this one is not going to come true.
Okay, this is a good counter argument against Perrin. I see.
But I mean, it deserves much more discussion. So, and I'm sure we'll discuss it, especially when we get to the end of the gospel,
Yes.
if not
Okay.
before.
Okay. We have touched upon a lot of important things today, some of which we have to postpone till we come to the place where the mark, as we have it, abruptly ends, whether the disciples obeyed Jesus or not. Let's continue next Thursday. And thanks to everyone who was with us, and especially to you, Joel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's fun. The
Thanks
highlight
a
of my
lot.
week.
Thanks a lot. Goodbye. See you.
Thank you.
До свидания. До
Да,
скорого.
До свидания.
Спасибо.